This lecture is on the nature of cognitive bias and when you should and shouldn't trust your own mind. Have you ever looked into a pond or a pool and seen it's super clear and seen sort of all the way to the bottom, seeing something that looked a lot closer than it actually was? You may have even tried to sort of reach for it, like reach into the water and grab a hold of it, but you miss it because the thing is actually deeper than you initially thought. This is because, well, rather obviously, sometimes things are not as they seem. In fact, quite often things seem to be one way and turn out to not be that way at all. This gives us a central distinction that's worth drawing. The distinction between seeming and being. Now, to understand what it is for something to seem to be one way or another, we need to already understand what it is for that thing to be that way. It can seem that the ball is red in a situation where there's an extremely red light because we already understand what it would be for the ball to be red in the first place. We understand what it is for a ball to be red. Whereas it can't seem to you that the ball is a prime number. This is because that just doesn't make any sense. You can't understand what it even means for a ball to be a prime number. So it can't seem like the ball is a prime number. Being and the nature of being is an age-old, ancient philosophical topic. Being, as sort of we take it on face value, is just existence. To be a thing that has being is to be a thing that exists. And existence entails that a thing has properties, as well as entailing that that thing is subject to the laws of thought. Remember, the laws of identity, the laws of non-contradiction, and the law of excluded middle. The study of being, the study of existence, is what we call in philosophy metaphysics. Now, once we've done a little bit of metaphysics and have a cursory understanding of what it is for something to be some way, we can start to think about what it is for someone to know that something is that way. Now we've got to distinguish between being and knowing, right? The ball could be red and bouncy and round, but that's different than Kyle, me, knowing that the ball is red, bouncy, and round. And that's because there's a whole lot more going on there. There's the ball being these ways is one relationship, right? The ball having certain properties. Whereas me knowing that the ball is that way is a whole nother relationship between me and the ball. And you might ask, how do I know that the ball is red, round, and bouncy? And probably the obvious answer is that I see it, right? I've seen it be round and red and bounce. Epistemology, as we touched on previously, studies the way that we know things, the way that we know how things are, and the ways that we can fail to know things. Now, there's lots of ways to fail at knowing something. We discussed that when we focused a little bit more on epistemology. But once again, sort of the most obvious case for not knowing things, for failing to know, is for what you believe to turn out to be false. Take, for instance, this seeming cluster of asparagus. And then someone cuts into the asparagus. And it turns out that it's a cake, because everything is a cake. Now, it seemed one way, right? It seemed like a cluster of asparagus, but it turned out to be another. We saw it as one thing, a cluster of asparagus, but that seeing was misleading. There are lots and lots of ways that we can be misled. Some ways are worse than others. Sometimes people lie or cheat in ways that can lead to great harm. And other times, people, you know, with no insincerity in their hearts, use faulty arguments to try and persuade. Most of this class up to this point has been an attempt to shed light on how you can avoid falling for such faulty arguments. Other times, it's not others that we need to be worried about. Sometimes we mislead ourselves. We self-deceive. We act in ways to avoid coming to learn bad news that we know is there, or we avoid criticism or difficult truths. Sometimes we're not even at fault for falling victim to our own mistaken forms of reasoning. Sometimes there are just simple issues of cognitive biases or perceptual illusions that cause us to come to believe false things. Perceptual illusions are a great starting point for coming to try to understand the general features and issues related to cognitive bias. In particular, just because, first of all, you come to believe a certain number of false things or do things that are problematic for your own purposes on the basis of illusions or mistakes in some way. So take, for instance, this bent pencil, right? Is this pencil actually bent, or are you just seeing it bent because it's immersed partially in water? And then, I mean, does the water actually bend the pencil? It doesn't seem so, right? You pull the pencil back out and it's straight. So the water isn't somehow like making the pencil bent. So then what exactly is it that you're seeing when you see a bent pencil that's partly in water? Well, you're seeing a straight pencil being bent, with where the seeming bentness comes from the light refraction in the water. And this, what you come to believe, I mean, at least initially on the basis of what you see here, if you've never seen this before, you might think, oh, I'm looking at a bent pencil. But upon, numerous occasions in which you've come to recognize that the light refraction from the surface of the water distorts the things that you see underneath it, well, now you hopefully no longer believe that when you put a pencil partially into water that it becomes bent. Instead, you believe something else. You believe that it's the way that the thing seems, but it's not the way that the thing is, because you recognize that something is in the way, is messing with your perception. This brings us to the really interesting case in the psychology of perception of constancies. Perceptual constancies are basically the constant presentations of your perceptual system of something being the same way under varying external conditions. Now, in order to understand this, it's a little bit complicated, but I would like to sort of just get it out there. First, you have to distinguish between what you perceive and what you sense. Now, what you sense is basically like, let's take your eyes, for instance. When you sense light, there are receptors in your eyes, basically, the rods and the cones. And there's light waves that bounce off of objects in the world, and they bounce in various frequencies, and the frequencies trigger the rods and cones in your eyeball. And that's what it is to sense light, basically. Then the sensation, the rods and cones trigger, and that sends electrical signals up to your brain. Now, perception is the sort of output of that whole process, right? You sense light with the rods and cones, and then there's a whole rigmarole that goes in between your eyeball and the thought about what you see, and that whole process is the perceiving process, right? So your eyeballs get triggered by the light, and that sends a signal up to your brain. Your brain does a bunch of stuff with different signals, and then that ultimately comes to a judgment where, like, you're looking at the red ball, and now you are thinking that the ball is red because of what you see, right? Now, perceptual constancy, given that distinction, is the ability that you have to see the thing in front of you as having the same color, even when there's a difference in the light that is hitting your eyes, right? So sometimes, you have a piece of white paper in sunlight and it looks white, and then if you move it into indoor light, like fluorescent light, it still looks white, even though the light reflecting off of that white piece of paper and hitting your eyes in the sunlight is very different than the light outside hitting your eyes. Similarly, like, you move something from a place with like a red light that's shining on it, and it looks red, to a blue light on it, and it looks white. Well, you're not thinking in terms of like the thing underlying having changed colors, right? It's the same color, and in red light it looks one way, and then in the blue light it looks another way, but then you're sort of still thinking of it as having the same color to begin with. Constancies are what explain why it is that when you look at this particular illusion that you see A and B as different colors, even though they ultimately are actually the same color that's hitting your eyeball. The reason is because we've been, our perceptual system has evolved to take shadows into account. And when you see, something that's color A in, abject sunlight, you'll see it as darker than if you see B, the same color, under what seems to be a shadow. Over the last few years, there have been a number of cases that have come up in popular media of constancies where, depending on how the sort of lighting in the photo is projected, you might see this dress as white and gold or as black and blue. Similarly, you can see this shoe as either gray or green or pink and white. The point of bringing up these perceptual constancies is just to show you some actual, like, psychological and scientific evidence of the ways in which our perceptual systems can be fooled in a sense. There are ways to get things that appear to us in the same way, and we have different perceptual experiences of them. Similarly, there is the sort of reverse, where we could have two totally different, in a sense, experiences of things, but perceive them in exactly the same way. We could have totally different senses in two different cases, but then the perception is seemingly the same. Another very interesting case of perceptual illusion is caused by this thing called cognitive penetration, where cognitive penetration has to do with the fact that sometimes certain cognitive systems, like your visual perceptive system, can infringe on other perceptual systems. So in this case, the McGurk effect, your visual perception is actually infringing upon your auditory perception. Go watch the video on Canvas for more information about this, but the basic idea is that depending on what you see, when you see this man's mouth moving, will affect what you actually hear. It's kind of off-putting once you come to realize just how difficult it is to stop yourself from hearing the incorrect sound when you're watching the guy make the mouth movements for the different sounds. Now, there are lots of cases of perceptual constancies and illusions that can result from playing with the background conditions of perception. But the point here isn't to sort of just show you instances of perceptual constancy and illusion. The point here is to show that once you know about these perceptual constancies and the possibilities of illusions that surround them, you can take certain epistemic steps to help safeguard against believing your eyes and ears in these kinds of situations. Perception itself is not wholly accurate all the time, we know that. And in some situations, it can be fooled. We need to be wary of those situations and then place limits on what it is that we're willing to believe without further evidence and experimentation, particularly regarding those situations. As an example, if you were caught up in the arguments over the color of the dress, you just shouldn't be arguing about that until you have a better picture of it, right? Especially if it's something that can, in a sense, be seen both ways. As it is with perception, so it is with all of cognition. Cognition being the mental faculties that allow us to think and judge and feel, etc. Cognition is an evolved trait in thinking creatures, as is perception. If we take evolution seriously, at some point there were no things that were actually cognizing, neither were there things that were ever perceiving. But at some point along the history of life, things emerged that could, in a primitive way, think. Maybe it's somewhat similar to how we think now in certain basic senses. Now, there are reasons for the ways that we perceive things. We fall victim to certain illusions because of those reasons. And similarly, there are reasons for the ways that we think. Certain features of our environments affected us in certain ways that allowed us to evolve, making it the case that we survived better or more often if we thought in those ways or perceived in those ways than not. The ancestors of ours that didn't evolve in these ways died off. Now, sometimes those reasons or features of the environment that caused us to think in certain ways were extremely helpful, and they helped lead us to make good choices in certain respects. But sometimes those reasons are more detrimental, especially in modern day situations. Take, for instance, the evolutionary process, like just as an example, of our eating habits. When we were on the savannah or the plains in Africa, humans evolved to like fatty foods and sugary foods because sweetness and fat are extremely important for our diets in order for us to satisfactorily continue to live. Whereas nowadays, too much fatty foods and sugary foods is ultimately bad for us. But that's partly because we live so much longer in modern day situations. We don't die from being, from being exposed or from other kinds of animals. Similarly, in a more cognitive sense, our fear response, right? So back when humans lived out, hunter-gatherer societies, there were lots of things that were dangerous to humans, lions, tigers, and bears. And when you heard some rustling in the bush, you might be afraid. You might run at the first sound. But today, there's not as many things that are as dangerous to us, and yet we still have certain extreme fear responses from, being in a room when it's dark out, or maybe, you see a spider. The spider is not dangerous to you, and the extreme fear that it might cause you is irrational in a sense. Now, just as with perceptual illusions, it's important to take note where and when we are likely to have certain cognitive biases. If we do this, we can be aware and careful not to judge too quickly, and we can put up certain epistemic guardrails against making mistakes in our beliefs where there are systematic failures in our reasoning abilities. There's a large number of different kinds of cognitive bias, and many of recent interest have been explored and exploited by these two researchers, Danny Kahneman and Tversky. These two guys work in the psychology departments, and they work on behavioral economics. Kahneman and Tversky have, in a way, revolutionized the way that we see and think about certain common processes of critical thinking and decision making. They show that often when we have to make snap judgments, like really fast decisions, we often rely on what are called heuristics, or simple rules that kind of help us to choose correctly. But these heuristics can quite often be fooled or made to lead us astray in our decision making. Now, there's tons and tons of content out there, both books and YouTube videos, on different cognitive biases. So I want you to go and watch the videos that I've posted for you to learn about these biases. The people that have produced these videos do a much better job than I possibly could. So I'll let you learn from them on those particular instances. However, there is one kind of bias that I'm going to finish this lecture with that I think really is important to discuss and point out. And that kind of bias has become called implicit bias. First, I think it's worth saying that pretty much almost all biases that people have are actually implicit, where by implicit we just mean that the bias flies under the radar. People don't know that they're biased. And this is because usually bias is seen as problematic, right? It's something that we need to root out in order to live in a fair society or something like that. This isn't exactly correct. Not all biases are bad, as you'll sort of see from studying the cognitive biases. Many of them are initially helpful or start off as following good rules, but then can become harmful when we're put into odd circumstances. But there is this thing that we call more often than not nowadays implicit bias that is generally harmful and problematic. And it's generally harmful and problematic because it involves our normative judgments. Our normative judgments are those kinds of judgments that involve saying whether or not something is good or bad, and that has to do with ethics and value judgments. The most common forms of these genuinely problematic implicit biases are against individuals of particular racial or ethnic groups and those of particular gender or sexual orientations. Of some of the more problematic and relevant implicit biases that we've seen come to be, I don't know, more interesting and more problematic, more worried about in the last decade, are things like certain kinds of unjustified discrimination, such as police profiling and the kinds of things that go on in police shootings. At least in the United States, African Americans are much more likely to be stopped by the police, and police are much more likely to be violent with them. There are cases of like simple unjustified discrimination. There are studies that have been done where people are given the exact same resume for a job, where the two different names, one sounds like a white name, like a John Smith, and the other one has a more African American style name, and people have this implicit bias to choose the white named person. Even when these people are, it's a fake, it's a setup. The whole thing is just a test, right? Similarly, there's lots of forms of sexual discrimination that can result in harassment. I think a simple case is just the example of mansplaining, which is basically a form of implicit bias that where guys don't recognize the possible competence and expertise of a woman just because she's a woman, and that's the kind of thing that's problematic. Similarly, catcalling and other forms of sexual harassment often can be, I would say, traced to a certain kind of implicit bias towards one way of thinking of these individuals of a particular gender rather than another. This brings me to the implicit association test, which was put on, I believe, by Harvard. And the implicit association test is a kind of test for possibly determining whether or not someone has some kind of implicit bias. So the implicit association test is this interesting tool that people have used in order to do certain psychological experiments on biases. And basically what the test does is it detects the time taken between associations. So you basically sit down at a computer and you have two different buttons that you have to press, and you have to associate one thing with another thing, and it just tests how long it takes you to do the association. And the idea is that when things become more disparate in your sort of unconscious mind, when concepts are farther apart or more different in your mind, then it takes you longer to know how to associate. And that basically is supposed to show, at least, that you have some form of cognitive dissonance between these two different concepts. And if you are slower at associating one with the other, then maybe you have some kind of bias, in particular when these concepts are normative. A simple sort of example of an implicit association test is something like this, where it's hard to look at these words and say the color that the word is written in, right? Because, or vice versa, right? Look at the word and say the word, like, sometimes these things are supposed to be cognitively dissonant. And so if you were just like shown these on a screen and were asked to say the color of the word, not the word itself, you would have, some kind of difficulty in doing so. The association test, in a sense, capitalizes on this fact, but attempts to kind of go deeper in the thought process being that if you do have some form of implicit bias, then ultimately you're going to associate certain normative notions like goodness and badness with different people differently, right? So if in the test, like one of the cases is, you get shown like black faces and white faces, and you're supposed to associate them with good or bad. And then it goes through and does it in all the different ways, right? So in one test, you're supposed to associate black face with bad and white face with good. And then in the next iteration, it'll switch. And then the idea is that it will test how long it takes you to actually do the association test. And on one case, usually you'll be better than the other. And if you're substantially better in one case over the other, then it does show that there's at least some kind of implicit bias that maybe you don't have actual cognitive access to. If the test is if the claim about the test is true, it does actually show some implicit bias, then it really does kind of tend to show that there's an implicit association in a number of people's minds between things like danger, violence, and badness, bad emotions, and black faces or black people generally. It also there's also other versions of the test, right, that tend to show a kind of implicit association between things like men and authority and strength and women and weakness and home life. There are lots of these, and many of them, kind of fit all of the cultural stereotypes that you can kind of think of, and these biases just ultimately become kind of very deep-seated within us, and so. It seems at least plausible that the test shows something along the lines of an interesting way in which we think in a deep-seated way. Now I've posted the link to the IAT website, the Implicit Association Test website on Canvas, and you should go ahead and try the test to see how you fare. There are a wide variety of association tests that are available, not just the race one or the sort of male-female one. There's even one where you can see what your implicit bias is towards presidents using different presidents' faces. Now, what can we do about these implicit biases? Well, one thing that's sort of worth recognizing is that being implicitly biased is pretty much a fact of life at the moment. It's hard to unlearn these like deep-seated mental things that you've learned or that are kind of buried in there. But it is worth recognizing that they are learned, right? These different kinds of prejudices, they may be cultural in origin, and so it's really hard to root them out in a culture and root them out in anyone in particular's mind that is part of that culture. And so ultimately we may not be able to really root out these implicit associations within a single generation, right? I mean, the civil rights movement started back in the 60s, and look where we still are, right? But none of that means that we shouldn't actually be trying, right? And trying in this kind of context, right? Like in a critical thinking class, I think it's helpful to kind of get you on board here. Like there's different kinds of critical thinking. One kind of critical thinking is about racial or just normative decision making, right? Goodness and badness decision making, being able to make quick decisions and knowing when to sort of slow down, right? You shouldn't feel bad about yourself if you have or recognize now that you have some kind of implicit bias in any form, but you shouldn't treat it flippantly. Like you shouldn't think nothing of it, right? What we need to do is take into consideration when making decisions, right? Just as with other kinds of cognitive biases where we recognize that we might be bad at making certain kinds of decisions, similar to cases where, like in perceptual illusions, where we recognize that we might be in a bad situation for knowing whether or not, some object is the way that it looks to us. We need to recognize that when in certain states, when certain matters come up, involving things like race or gender or whatever you might actually be biased about. We need to stop and slow down when it comes to making our choices. We need to be more thoughtful in our choices and, attempt to avoid falling victim to the biases, the underlying biases that we may have. So I'll leave you today with this quote that I love from Nelson Mandela, and just a suggestion to go now and watch all of the other videos that have been posted to learn all about the different kinds of cognitive bias.